Okay, in this video we're going to go into more detail on the structures and functions of the dermis. Remember, the dermis is a strong, flexible, connective tissue layer of skin just deep to the epidermis. Because it's made of connective tissue, the major cell type here is the fibroblast because it's CT proper. And we can also find other immune cells like macrophages, which are phagocytes, and mast cells, which are involved with inflammation, and other white blood cells that can enter the tissue from your bloodstream. Now, we find that the fibers in your dermis make up the hide that's used to make leather, and other animals. Now, in the dermis, we also have nerves, blood vessels, and lymphatic vessels. Nerves are involved with, cutaneous sensations. Blood vessels are involved with thermoregulation and supplying nutrients. And lymphatic vessels pick up excess fluid to be returned back to your bloodstream, and they're involved with immune defense. So we also find other hair follicles in the dermis, oil glands, and sweat glands, which we'll go into more detail later in this chapter. And there's two major layers of dermis. We got the papillary layer and the reticular layer. So in terms of the dermis, remember we have the papillary layer, which is this sort of peg-like projections here. In fact, papilla also means nipple, so apparently these are nipple-shaped projections. The papillary layer of dermis is made of loose areolar connective tissue, which can help to nourish, the epidermis here. We find that the dermis has your reticular layer, which is the deeper 80%, and the reticular layer is made of a dense, irregular connective tissue. Now, the papillary layer is more superficial, and again, it's made of areolar connective tissue that's loose and interlacing with collagen elastic fibers and blood vessels. These loose fibers allow for phagocytes to patrol microorganisms more readily, and the abundant ground substance in this areolar connective tissue can also help to nourish the stratum basale of epidermis. Now, dermal papilla are superficial regions of the dermis that are finger-like projections, and these contain capillary loops and free nerve endings and touch receptors like tactile corpuscles. Now, in thick skin, it turns out that dermal papilla lie atop the dermal ridges, which give rise to the epidermal ridges. And these epidermal ridges are what we also call friction ridges or fingerprints. These actually enhance gripping ability. They contribute to the sensation of touch because each one has a lot of Meissner's corpuscles. And they also have sweat pores that leave a unique fingerprint pattern. So looking here, we can see then that the dermal papilla, if they're lined up in rows, would form the friction ridges here. So each have individual papilla within this, and the epidermis would kind of fold over those patterns. And you can see all these holes are the openings to the sweat glands or pores. And this is essentially what a fingerprint looks like. Now, the reticular layer of dermis is the deeper 80%. It's a more of a coarse, dense, fibrous connective tissue with lots of elastic fibers. And collagen fibers here provide strength and resiliency. They help to bind water and keep your skin hydrated. And within the reticular layer, we also find a cutaneous plexus, which is basically a large network of blood vessels just between the reticular layer and the hypodermis. So just kind of like forming the inferior or deeper boundary of skin. And this is going to be involved with temperature regulation and storage of blood. Now, the extracellular matrix also contains little pockets of adipose, so you can find some adipocytes in the reticular layer as well. Now, it turns out that we actually have something called cleavage or tension lines in the reticular layer that are caused by collagen fibers that run parallel to the skin surface. They are externally invisible, but they're going to affect the way that skin, resists tension and force and gravity in that regard. So it's important for surgeons to be aware of these cleavage lines because they need to make incisions that are parallel to lines of cleavage. So if you want to cut with these lines of cleavage, with the grain, parallel to these collagen fibers, because if you cut against them perpendicularly, you're going to cut through more of these collagen fibers and it's going to delay healing time. So this is just showing the lines of cleavage here, and you can see that they're in different patterns. But essentially what these would be are the orientation of collagen fibers in the dermis all around your body, and you can see that they kind of orient themselves in a variety of ways in different areas of skin. You can see that the face is very complex. So if you're a plastic surgeon, considering the lines of cleavage is a much more complex task. Whereas if you're doing, a incision on the thigh or the abdominal area, these are much more simple arrangements where they either go transverse or oblique, or oblique as well. Now, flexure lines are essentially dermal folds near joints, and you find that the dermis is tightly secured to deeper structures here. And this helps to ensure that skin doesn't slide easily for joint movement, and causes these deep creases. That way the joints can move more easily. And you find them visible in the hands, wrists, and fingers, and soles and toes. So this is showing flexure lines, which are just sort of deeper creases in the reticular layer of dermis that your whole skin kind of goes with the shape of, and so they actually form these deeper lines, which are the flexure lines. These are called striae, or stretch marks, and you can see here that this is actually areas where the skin has been pulled apart, and because of the stretching of the reticular layer of dermis, these lines are visible where there's sort of thinner areas of skin. That's why they appear to be more red. And this would be an example of like stretch marks, during pregnancy.